and welcome to today's Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan. This commission last held a hearing on women's rights in Afghanistan in May of 2011. I look back at that hearing, and it was a moment of cautious hope. Yes, women faced serious obstacles to the realization of their rights and aspirations, but in the 10 years after the Taliban were removed from power in 2001, Afghanistan had ratified the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. A new constitution guaranteed equality of men and women before the law. Violence against women, including rape and forced marriage, had been criminalized. Women and girls could attend school and university. Women could work. They could run for office. Today, all of that has been taken away. We are approaching the third anniversary of the Taliban's 2021 return to power. In the last 3 years, Afghanistan has become the most repressive country in the world regarding women's rights. Those are in the words of the head of the UN assistance mission in Afghanistan. The worst in the world, and that's saying a lot. The restrictions that the Taliban have imposed on women are so extensive that the U.S. Institute for Peace and the Atlantic Council had to set up online resources to keep track of all of them. Our witnesses will go into greater detail, but to highlight a few examples. Today in Afghanistan, women and girls' access to secondary school and university is suspended. Women are banned from working for national and international NGOs and UN agencies. Women cannot visit parks or go to gyms, and the Taliban have closed all beauty salons. Women cannot protest. They cannot obtain driver's licenses. They cannot be seen in public after 7 p.m. They cannot laugh aloud in public. They must be covered from head to toe, and on and on and on. One institutional change seems to me to capture the essence of all that has happened. The Taliban replaced the Ministry of Women's Affairs with the Ministry of Vice and Virtue. This medieval attack on women is well documented. Several UN bodies, many human rights and women's rights organizations, and the State Department have issued reports on the systemic repression and its economic and social consequences. The restrictions on women deepen deprivations that affect society as a whole, such as hunger and food insecurity, that cycle back to hit women and girls the hardest, forcing many families to barter the lives of their daughters for food. The consequences also include a surge in women committing suicide. Just last weekend, I saw a new report of a 19-year-old woman who took her life by suicide after being abused in a Taliban prison. Without objections, I will be entering several of these reports into the record. Our question today is what can we do about this crisis, which is doing immense and possibly irreversible harm to current and future generations. Supporting women and girls in Afghanistan was a major focus of U.S. policy before the return of the Taliban and remains a stated policy priority today. The appointment of the first special envoy for Afghan women, girls, and human rights in December of 2021 was an important diplomatic signal, and I'm glad that the special envoy is joining us today. Congress has continued to fund programs to support the Afghan people, including women and girls. Some of the money is set aside to document and investigate the abuses being committed against them, but no one can be happy with where we find ourselves. I recognize that the context we are discussing is difficult, but I hope that this hearing will serve to identify approaches that could make a difference in the lives of women and girls who are being subjected to thoroughly dehumanizing treatment. At a minimum, I believe women and girls must be front and center in all U.S. engagement with the Taliban, and we should ask ourselves whether we are doing all in our power to pursue full accountability for policies that likely amount to crimes against humanity. Our witnesses this afternoon include 3 women from Afghanistan and a 4th who spent years on the ground there. They know what they speak, and I look forward to their recommendations. I will say for the record that my co-chair, Congressman Smith, has been unavoidably detained and will not make this hearing, but I know he cares very deeply about these issues as well. And I'm happy to be here with my colleague Jason Crow, who I will yield to in a minute. But I should also tell you that we're not in session this week. So I think a lot of members who are interested in this are back in their districts. But we thought it was important to go forward with this hearing, so I appreciate everybody being here. Let me yield to my colleague if he has any comments he wants to make at the outset.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Chairman Smith, for calling this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses from both panels for joining us in person and virtually today. Your advocacy is as crucial in this moment as it has ever been. I hope that we spend today exploring the ways in which the Taliban have failed to uphold the many commitments they made prior to the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. As we all know, the Taliban have spent nearly 3 years specifically targeting the human rights of women and girls, including their right to education, work, movement, and assembly. This is also an important opportunity for us as members of Congress to hear from our panelists about their recommendations for how we can better address the Taliban's assault on human rights in Afghanistan. The ramifications of the restrictions placed on the private and public lives of women in Afghanistan have exacerbated the country's humanitarian and economic crisis that we need to do more to address and be more creative to engage effectively to address this reality for too many Afghans. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan as an Army Ranger, and I'm grateful for the service and sacrifice of my Afghan partners and our allies, and for that, and for their families who were and remain to this day, in many cases, in great danger because of their service. I want to condemn the Taliban's assault on human rights and the specific targeting of women and girls. We spent 2 decades in Afghanistan supporting efforts to build democracy and promote the rights of women and girls, and the Taliban's edicts have undermined the progress made throughout those years. The difference is stark and impossible to ignore. We have a duty to not look away. Second, I want to express support for Afghans who live under the restrictions imposed by the Taliban and who continue to be subjected to the gross human rights abuses. It is my belief that the United States government must continue to provide humanitarian assistance in light of the dire and ongoing economic and humanitarian crisis in the country, and continue working to ensure that we do so without the diversion of aid to the Taliban. And third, I believe that it should be the goal of the U.S. government to raise the experience of women and girls in Afghanistan in our engagements with allies and to work together on a comprehensive long-term strategy response that more robustly incorporates expert recommendations. We can adapt, be creative, and develop new legislative approaches. I look forward to hearing from our panelists on their recommendations for how Congress can show up more effectively in this moment. I'll note that I have a resolution that acknowledges the necessity of all 3 of those ideas that was unanimously supported by the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I hope that it can come before the full House for a vote so that every member of this body is able to register their condemnation of the Taliban and their continued support for Afghan women and girls. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I want to ask unanimous consent that Congresswoman Ilhan Omar will be able to submit a statement for the record. Again, she wanted to be here. We have a great lineup of witnesses. We're going to begin with Rina Amiri, Special Envoy for Afghan Women, Girls, and Human Rights at the U.S. Department of State. I should note for the record that I want to welcome you back to the Commission. You were a witness in the 2011 hearing that I mentioned in my opening statement. I think at the time you were Senior Advisor on Afghanistan for the Office of the Special Representative to Afghanistan and Pakistan for the Department of State. I want to ask unanimous consent that your full biography be put in the record, as well as all the other witnesses have these great biographies, but you're also accomplished. It will take me the whole hearing to read them all. So I'm going to we'll put them in the record as they appear. So let me yield to you for your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman McGovern, and I'm appreciative to you and Chairman Smith for convening this important discussion today. I want to express my deep appreciation for convening a hearing on the human rights situation in Afghanistan, and I want to thank Representative Crow for making time to be with us today. We are nearing the 3-year mark since the Taliban takeover. Since August 2021, the Taliban have adopted policies that have radically undermined the rights that Afghans so valiantly strive to regain over the last 2 decades. The Taliban have severely restricted the exercise of freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly, including for members of the media, particularly women journalists. The rights of individuals belonging to religious and ethnic minorities are under immense threat. And while the Taliban have announced a policy of general amnesty, the risk of retributive and political violence against former government and security officials remains severe, and LGBTQI+ persons and members of other vulnerable groups fear for their very lives. The Taliban's extreme edicts directly targeting women and girls have been the most calamitous. We recognize these institutionalized efforts by the Taliban as gender persecution. It has been over 1,000 days since girls above 6th grade were effectively banned from attending school. Women are restricted from most sectors of work and their mobility, access to healthcare and protection services, and access to public space and civic roles are severely limited. Those who oppose these policies they and their families are threatened with violence, disappearances, and detention. In his June report to the Human Rights Council, Richard Bennett, the UN Special Rapporteur for Afghanistan, describes the situation as relentless issuance and enforcement of edicts, decrees, and declarations and orders that interlock to form a countrywide system of oppression and abuse in which all communities in Afghanistan, particularly women and girls, find themselves ensnared. Given the extreme anti-rights ideology and power dynamics within the Taliban, the road ahead will continue to be difficult. As we remain cognizant of these challenges, we are resolute in supporting the demands of all Afghans for their rights to be respected, particularly Afghan women and girls who are at the forefront of these efforts. As Special Rapporteur Bennett has insisted, we must adopt an all-tools approach, and such holistic thinking has guided our multi-pronged strategy. First, in every diplomatic engagement focused on Afghanistan, we underscore the centrality of human rights, particularly the rights of women and girls. We see it as key to the stability we all seek in Afghanistan and in the region. In our bilateral and multilateral engagements, we make clear that human rights are at the heart of U.S. policy and cannot be siloed or deprioritized. We have repeatedly underscored to the Taliban that any significant step toward normalization of relations is contingent on profound improvements in their human rights conduct. We have engaged in various efforts globally with our allies, the region, and all relevant actors to align with these policies, underscoring the pernicious effect of the Taliban's human rights policies on regional and global interests, which include strengthening Afghan's economy, stemming migration flows, and preventing the country from moving towards violent extremism and further repression. We have prioritized Muslim country engagement in our diplomatic efforts, recognizing the vital role that they must play in countering the Taliban's narratives about the rights of women. The Afghan people have overwhelmingly made clear that they want their daughters to be educated, to work, and to participate in public life. Second, we have sought to inject the voices of Afghan women and civil society into our own key policy deliberations, as well as multilateral settings where the future of Afghanistan is discussed. To this end, we established the U.S.-Afghan Consultative Mechanism in 2022, which serves as a platform to facilitate direct and systematic engagement between U.S. policymakers, both senior and working level, and Afghan experts. In addition, we have advocated for Afghan and civil society participation in key multilateral forums, including the recent UN-led Doha meeting. Third, we support the creativity and determination of Afghan women and girls to secure education, employment, and income-generating opportunities despite the challenges that they face every day. My office with Secretary Blinken launched the Alliance for Afghan Women's Economic Resilience, a public-private partnership with Boston University focused on advancing Afghan women's entrepreneurship, workforce participation, and educational opportunities in Afghanistan and third countries. The State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development implement a number of programs to promote and advance the rights of women and girls, including various education programs for Afghan women to pursue higher education, vocational training, and job skill development. Women and girls are integral to USAID's programs in Afghanistan, from supporting female entrepreneurs and health workers to training teachers and educating girls. Preserving and expanding women and girls' access to education, health services, economic empowerment, and life-saving support is central to our ongoing commitment in Afghanistan. Fourth, we are supporting protection and accountability measures for the short and long term, which includes using all the authorities at our disposal. The U.S. government has imposed global Magnitsky sanctions and pursued visa restrictions, including through the development of a policy that cover Taliban members and other individuals believed to be responsible for or complicit in the repression of women and girls. We also continue to support and robustly implement the UN sanctions on 135 individuals and 5 entities associated with the Taliban. Additionally, we work with UN mechanisms, including the UN Special Rapporteur, UN Women, the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan, and Afghans and international organizations on a range of initiatives designed to promote accountability. And fifth, we continue to be the largest donor of humanitarian assistance, recognizing that Afghan women and vulnerable communities bear the brunt of the humanitarian crisis. Since 2021, we have provided $2.1 billion in life-saving assistance. We have worked diligently with the donor community to ensure the principled delivery of humanitarian assistance, such that women are meaningfully involved in the design and delivery cycle and have safe and dignified access to services. We are under no illusion about the challenges ahead, but we must match the determination and resilience of Afghans, particularly Afghan women themselves. Supporting human rights is not just a moral imperative, it is a strategic imperative. As a women's rights expert in Afghanistan recently noted to me, the world is watching, both to condemn and to emulate. If repressive anti-rights elements will cede the rights of women and girls to the Taliban, they will be inspired to emulate and impose this in other fragile societies, spawning more repression. Supporting the rights of Afghans, particularly the rights of women and girls, is integral to our collective and our global interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, let me say we appreciate your role as U.S. Special Envoy, and thank you for being here. But for the record, Ms. Amiri, please clarify the current status of U.S. engagement with the Taliban. Has the U.S. recognized the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan? Has the U.S. signed any treaties or other binding agreements with the Taliban? What is the appropriate way to describe the current relationship?
Thank you very much for that question. And I know that remains on the minds of everyone. The U.S. has not recognized the Taliban. We do not see normalization as moving forward in the way that the Taliban desire until the Taliban meet their international obligations, as well as the priorities that we have noted. Our priorities in Afghanistan is making sure that Afghanistan does not once again become a sanctuary for terrorism, that Afghans who seek to leave the country are able to do so, particularly our allies who are in the resettlement pipeline. We are looking to provide humanitarian assistance in the country in a way that is unhindered and that we can do it in a principled way as we do globally. And of course, we are working diligently for the release of American detainees. And of course, human rights, particularly the situation of women and girls, is at the heart of our policymaking, and it's across all efforts. And we've made it clear to the Taliban, to our allies, and to the global community repeatedly that until the Taliban significantly improve the situation for women's rights, for human rights in general, there's not going to be a movement in the direction they seek towards normalization.
Thank you. I appreciate your statement that the U.S. Underscores the centrality of human rights, particularly the rights of women and girls, in its diplomatic engagement with the Taliban. On June 29th, 2024, you tweeted, and I quote, "Decision-making forums on the future of Afghanistan must include the full diversity of Afghans, particularly women, to have any legitimacy with the Afghan people, and that Afghans, especially women, must be given spaces at the table to advocate on their own behalf." So it is my understanding that you attended Doha 3 a few weeks ago, and a meeting convened by the UN that was strongly criticized for excluding the participation of Afghan women. And because women's rights were not on, the agenda, how do you respond to this kind of criticism?
Thank you. You know, I consulted, as well as my colleagues, Representative West and others in the State Department, consulted widely with Afghan women, and we heard their concern, and we shared their concern, and we engaged robustly with the UN, not only us, but also many of our allies. And we made clear that our attendance would be possible only if we were assured that human rights would be meaningfully addressed in the meeting and that women would be able to participate in the meeting in person. And we only confirmed our participation once we were confident that that was the case. I'd be glad to provide more details if needed in terms of how that took place.
Thank you. That would be helpful, and we can maybe follow up. I mean, if you want.
Yes, please. Yes, and you know, when there were several things, I want to say at the outset, though, I think that there's certainly room for improvement. This was the third meeting that took place on the UN-led process. The first one was among the member states. The second one, civil society participated. The Taliban chose not to. And in this third one, the Taliban participated, but there was also a civil society event that took place. But there's much more that needs to be done as this moves forward towards becoming a meaningful process. But in this meeting, what encouraged me is throughout the discussion with the Taliban, nearly every country in that room spoke about the situation of women's rights and how important it was for them, including countries that, quite frankly, surprised me, where I did not expect that to be at the top of their agenda. Inclusion and women's rights was at the forefront of the agenda. The Undersecretary for the UN also opened up her statement by noting the UN Charter and the Taliban's international legal obligations. And there was a civil society event that took place the day after the meeting with the Taliban, in which there was a good discussion with those civil society participants who chose to attend. There were others that didn't choose to attend, I think for very legitimate reasons.
Thank you. You mentioned that your office is working closely with UN mechanisms on a range of initiatives to promote accountability. Can you say anything more about those initiatives? In your view, do we have all the legal tools we need for this purpose? Do these initiatives encompass truth-telling and proposals for reparations?
Thank you. We're doing a number of efforts in coordination with the UN. One, we have supported the mandate of the Special Rapporteur for Afghanistan, the UN Special Rapporteur for Afghanistan, and we work very closely with his office. And his office is one of the principal actors that is really doing evidence-based work to this end and informing the global community in terms of how we should be moving forward. We also have worked to ensure that the mandate of the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA, remains robust and that human rights is an integral part of that work. We work closely with UN Women that has provided excellent reporting as well as in-country operations that we support. USAID, I believe, has provided UN Women over $36 million to provide support to women and girls, including supporting mechanisms to address Afghan women at risk.
Just one final thing. I mean, so you left Afghanistan as a refugee when you were a child. You appeared before this commission, as we mentioned, 13 years ago, at a time when the rights situation in Afghanistan seemed to be somewhat more hopeful. Your personal and professional lives are deeply intertwined with Afghanistan's war-torn history. Given your background and your experience, can you share any personal reflections on the moment in which we find ourselves right now?
Thank you. Yes, Afghanistan is, I'm of Afghan heritage, and every generation back in my family is from Afghanistan. I can tell you my first story about Afghanistan. My grandmother, she sought, with her father's support, to get an education. But it was a local mullah, a local religious authority, that prevented her from getting an education. And throughout her life, to the day she died, and I've seen many other women, Afghan women, and women globally, have such struggles, and it's been, it's been formative for me. I have followed Afghan history. I've lived in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan, unfortunately, is in a context in which, for women, in many phases of its history, it's been 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. That is where we are, but it's unprecedented, only precedented by the last time that the Taliban were in power, because while there have been enormous challenges for Afghan women throughout history, there's never been a centralized a regime that has centralized the oppression of women and girls in the way that the Taliban have. It has never been this extreme and dogmatic. And I think we are finding ourselves once again in an extraordinary situation in which the rights that Afghan women themselves struggled so valiantly for, not in just the last 2 decades, but over 100 years, are being rolled back. And as I noted, I not only see this as from a perspective of someone of Afghan heritage as critical, but I see it critical as an American. And I see it critical as a policy actor, because when women disappear, when women are stripped from society, a society moves towards radicalism. It becomes a security threat, it becomes an economic threat, and that is what we're facing in Afghanistan.
I appreciate it. Thank you. I'll yield to my colleague, Mr. Crow.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Special Envoy Amiri, for your leadership and the work that you've put in over many years to help bend the curve in a positive direction. As we talk about trying to push the Taliban to reform and to keep its promises, there's always this question of, what balance of condemnation versus incentives to try to use to get them to reform and to keep those promises. And, having fought the Taliban, I know that they're not a monolith. Right? There's different groups of Taliban that fall on different spectrums in terms of their views of the matter, and to the degree to which some of them want international recognition and want to kind of join the international world versus those who don't. Can you just paint a picture for us a little bit as to what is the current state of the Taliban overall, and what would you advise policymakers to do in striking that balance between incentives versus condemnation to achieve better results?
Thank you. It is indeed a situation in which there are no easy answers. Despite the Taliban's draconian policies, we are in a context in which they are the reality on the ground, and a context in which, if looking back at 40 years of conflict in Afghanistan, I think there is consensus there are no military solutions in Afghanistan. We tried in the 1990s a policy of isolation that only led to greater radicalization. And now we are trying to identify creative solutions, out-of-the-box solutions, including doing exactly what you noted, identifying both the carrots and the sticks. And this is where the UN-led process is important. The UN-led process is guided by the independent assessment that was produced after a Security Council resolution calling on the Secretary General to put forward a framework for moving forward with greater coherence in terms of both policy making on economic stabilization, as well as getting the Taliban to move forward and meeting its international obligations. And that is what we hope that this UN-led process can move forward to, and making sure that we, as the international community, develop coherence so that we speak in one voice to the Taliban and note to them that there are some concrete steps that you can take in the right direction that will lead to Afghanistan's reintegration into the international community. Or you can become a pariah, an even bigger pariah than you were in the 1990s if you continue moving in that direction. And to make clear that all of that is there in terms of both, but the sticks are very clear. This is one of the most sanctions groups in the world. There's 135 UN sanctions right now against Taliban authorities, as well as many bilateral sanctions. But there's also a possibility for those Talibs that claim that they want to move forward in a way that makes Afghanistan less aid-dependent and move towards stability, that there is a road forward, and that is what we hope to work on through this process.
Are there enough Taliban members and of senior authority and influence who are interested in trying to move towards reform, or to some degree seeking international recognition, right, and engagement? Are there enough of those folks that actually could be a meaningful approach? I mean, can you, because I know there's a contest right now.
Yes. That is the question. That is not. It is the question of whether there are enough, and it is a question of whether those representatives of the Taliban will follow strategic interests to move Afghanistan towards stabilization, or if they're going to continue moving the country towards radicalization, poverty, and continue the cycle of conflict.
Okay. And I think there's also sometimes a misunderstanding in Congress about the nature of aid, humanitarian aid, and how that impacts oppressive regimes. Right? We often have this debate about whether or not to provide aid to Iran or North Korea, to the people, not to the regimes. Could you talk to us about how providing humanitarian aid to women and girls or to families in Afghanistan helps push those oppressive regimes, or in this case, the Taliban, and hold them accountable? Right? What is the real impact on the ground?
I think one of the points that we have to remember, Afghanistan faces two fundamental points of crisis. More, but I'm going to focus on two. One is it's a country in overwhelming crisis from a humanitarian point of view, and that the extreme economic situation that the country faces, and also one of the worst human rights situation. But in Afghanistan, just like anywhere else in the world, when the economy collapses, those that are most vulnerable, those that are that hit the hardest, are women in vulnerable communities. Right now, if you look at any data, you see that women, and that's certainly the case in Afghanistan. And what I hear from Afghan women is, I spend a lot of time talking to Afghan women inside and outside the country, is that they want us to put all of the tools at our disposal to try to improve the situation for them. They did not choose the Taliban. They are the ones that are suffering from this humanitarian disaster, and certainly the majority of them that I speak to want us to do more. Creating space for them is also making sure that they're not under even more duress.
So is it safe to say that if people are hungry, insecure, or sick, they're less able to resist and to put pressure on oppressive regimes.
That's exactly right, and that is something that we have witnessed in any country, as you noted, in any country that is in a dire humanitarian situation. You have to be able to address at least your basic needs in order to be able to push back against such forces.
And would you say that's one of the primary goals of that aid? You know, there's the moral component that, you know, morally we want people to not starve and to be secure and to have human rights, but there's also the very real practical component that if we provide aid, they are able to resist and push back more.
Absolutely. I would say that everything that we're doing in Afghanistan, it's not charity-based. These are strategic imperatives for us. This is a country that we have seen when we walk away from it, when we when we leave it to extreme poverty and hunger and isolation, you get radicalism. And that is, we do not want to repeat what we've seen throughout history in Afghanistan.
I have one last question. I lead a bill, the Afghan Allies Protection Act, that authorizes additional Afghan special immigrant visas and extends the life of the program and makes reforms. But there's also the Priority 1 and Priority 2 programs as well that are broader than the SIV program. Advocates have raised concerns that the current criteria for Priority 1, Priority 2, and SIVs are tailored more towards men, and that there should be a more robust way to support women and girls at risk in Afghanistan. Could you comment on that and what we would need to do to tweak those programs to better support women and girls?
Thank you. I work very closely with the CARE office, but I would turn to my CARE colleagues for this the specificity I think that this type of conversation would require. I can note that this is a conversation that we have quite frequently, and they are quite concerned and recognize that Afghan women and girls are the most vulnerable of the populations that need relocation and resettlement. Right now, in terms of the numbers we're looking at, 50% of those that have been resettled are women, and I believe that we have over 75,000 that have been resettled in the United States.
Thank you. I appreciate your leadership and all the work you do, and you and all of those watching today should know that there are an awful lot of Americans who will not forget Afghanistan and Afghans, and will continue to work as much as we can and as hard as we can to protect and defend our Afghan friends and to help move this in a better direction. So thank you for your service.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I want to associate myself with his just last statement as well. I mean, I think it is important to make it clear that we're not going to forget the people of Afghanistan. And before I have you go, I just wanted to maybe for the record, you in your testimony, you say we have prioritized Muslim majority country engagement in our diplomatic efforts. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that entails?
Yes, thank you. This is, when I first was appointed to this position, and Secretary Blinken asked me what my priorities would be, and I noted a couple of key points. One of them is ensuring that Afghan women's voices themselves will be at the fore, and two, that we would really mobilize Muslim-majority countries, because quite frankly, the West should not be the loudest voice on this issue, because as I've said to our Muslim-majority partners, that what the Taliban is doing is also a disservice to what many of these countries seek. And I've particularly appreciated the work that the OIC has done, as well as Qatar, UAE, Indonesia, and many others. The last time that the Taliban were in power, there was not very much in the way of condemnation from Muslim-majority countries. At this time, we hear Muslim-majority countries across the board challenge the Taliban in terms of the narrative that they create about women's rights. And I think that they're the most effective voices, not just to speak to the Taliban, but to also make sure that the Afghan population hear from them that this is not something that is supported by any country in the region, neighbors and countries that have similar cultures and backgrounds.
I just want to say one other thing here, and that is that I appreciate the fact that you've said that the human rights, you mentioned human rights is the key to stability, and I want to thank you for recognizing this because it means that human rights cannot be an afterthought in all of this. And just the final thing I promise is that how can Congress be most supportive of your work?
I think exactly what you're doing right now, putting a spotlight on the situation of Afghan women and girls, is probably one of the most important. The situation in Afghanistan and the situation of women and girls is absolutely key. It is right now globally we live in a time with a great number of challenges. But Afghanistan is a context in which we have to remember that it doesn't, the instability simply doesn't go away. The extremism and radicalism that could emerge from Afghanistan, if it is left without the type of attention that it deserves, particularly when we have the worst situation in the world for women. As the UN has noted, this is something that I think will create a precedence and will create more radicalization in different parts of the world. So your attention, your partnership is something that I'm deeply appreciative of.
Well, again, we appreciate you being here. We appreciate the work that you're doing, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate with you on how to address some of these horrific challenges that especially women and girls are facing right now in Afghanistan. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Now we're going to go to our next panel, and some are going to be virtual and some are going to be in person. So the people who are in person come up to the table here. Wahida Amiri, who's a librarian and women's rights activist, and has been recognized for her steadfast protest against the Taliban bans on women's education and work, and we welcome her. Mitra Mehrun is the Afghanistan Advocacy Fellow at Amnesty International, and a gender equity and human rights activist and practitioner from Afghanistan. She's made a decade of experience in international development, peace, and gender equality. And Heather Barr, who's an associate director at the Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. She's researched human rights issues, including child marriage, girls' education, gender-based violence, rights of refugees and prisoners, torture, and human trafficking. She's worked on the ground in Afghanistan, and there's another page. Yeah, I'm getting my other page here. Stefano Gennarini is the Vice President for Legal Studies at the Center for Family and Human Rights, and he represents CFAM at the UN headquarters in New York and researches and writes on international law policy. Jane Adolph is a professor of law at Ave Maria School of Law in Naples, Florida, and an adjunct professor of law at the University of Notre Dame of Law in Sydney, Australia. She has worked as an external and internal legal advisor to the Holy See. And I think I get everybody here. So, Ms. Amiri, we will begin with you. And just make sure your mic is on.
خانم ها و آقایان درود. تشکر میکنم از فرصتی که امروزه برای صحبت در اینجا برایم دادید. باید بگویم صحبت کردن در اینجا برایم آسان نیست. ممکن این را از لرزش صدا و سرعت نفسهایم متوجه شوید. دلیل این امر این است که هرگز قرار نبود و نخواسته بودم در چنین فضای حضور داشته باشم و سخنرانی کنم. من یک کتاب خانه‌دار بودم و تنها چیزی که از زندگی می‌خواستم این بود که در شهر خودم فرصت و فضای داشتن یک کتابخانه و مدیریت آن را داشته باشم. اگر امروزه اینجا حضور دارم بخشاً به همین دلیل است. میدانم ممکن ارتباط این دو منطقی به نظر نرسد. بگذارید قبل از تشریح این ارتباط بگویم چی کارهای دیگری برای این آرزوی ساده کردم و چیها بر سرم رفته است.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. I must say that it's not easy for me to speak here. You may understand this from my trembling in my voice and the sharpness of my breath. This is because I was never supposed to and did not want to be present and gave a speech in such spaces. I was a simple librarian, and only thing I wanted from life was to own and manage a library in my own city. I'm here today. It's partly for this reason. I know that the connection between the two may not seem reasonable, but before explaining the relationship between the two, please allow me to tell you that I have done chasing this simple dream and what has happened to me.
خانم ها و آقایان، بخشش من انگلیسی یاد ندارم دیگه، به زبان خود میخوانم برشون مهم. فعلا بگو باز. خانم ها و آقایان، من برای آرزوی ساده در مقابل بزرگترین گروه تروریستی تاریخ یعنی طالبان که تا دندان با جنگ افزارهای امریکایی مسلح است به خیابان رفته ام. خشونتی را تجربه کرده ام که کمترین آن گاز اشکاور بوده. تحت تعقیب قرار گرفته ام، با تکرار و از نشانی‌های مختلف اخطار داده شده ام. بعد توسط این گروه تروریستی اختطاف شده و زندان شده ام. بعد از نیمه شبها از من تحقیق شده، از من انسانیت زدایی شده و به اعتراف اجباری مجبور ساخته شده ام. خانه و خانواده ام گروگان گرفته شده و در پایان تعبید شده ام. جزئیات هر کدام این واقعیت خود می توانند مبنای سخنرانی های متعدد دیگری باشد. ولی آنچه می خواهم اینجا بگویم این است که بله، همه اینها برای این که به عنوان یک زن آرزوی داشتن کتابخانه ای را داشتم بر سرم رفت. برای یک آرزوی ساده. 70 سال بعد از اعلامیه جهانی حقوق بشر.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the pursuit of this simple wish, I have gone to the street, facing the biggest terrorist group in the history, the Taliban, which is armed to the teeth with American weapons. I have experienced violence, at least of which was tear gas. I have been persecuted. I have been warned and threatened repeatedly. Then I was kidnapped and imprisoned by this terrorist group. I have been questioned in the midnights. I have been dehumanized and forced to confess. My house and family were taken hostages, and in the end, I was exiled. The details of each of these hardships can be the subject of many other speeches. But I want to say that yes, all this happened because I, as a woman, dreamed of having a library. It happened to thousands of other women and me in Afghanistan for having such a simple dream. Ironically, after 70 years of Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
خانم ها و آقایان، آنگونه که در آغاز گفتم مبارزه و حضور امروز من اینجا بخش برای این آرزوی انفرادی خودم بوده است. بخش دیگر و بزرگتر این مبارزه برای مردم است که توسط طالبان از تمامی حقوق انسانی و بشریشان محروم ساخته شده اند. برای میلیون‌ها دختر افغانستان است که از رفتن به مکتب و دانشگاه باز مانده اند. و برای صدها هزار زنی که بیکار و در 4 دیواری خانه زندانی ساخته شده اند. بله، بخش بزرگتر این مبارزه برای مردم است که از آنان به تمام معنا انسانیت زدایی شده و زیر سلطه یک گروه تروریستی تا دندان مسلح به حال خود رها شده اند. برای زنانی که 30 سال می شود زیر سلطه یک رژیم آپارتاید جنسیتی زندگی می کنند. از تمامی حقوقشان محروم ساخته شده و در تمام عرصه های زندگی با حذف تفکیک و جداسازی، شرپنداری و سرکوب مواجه‌اند. متاسفانه باید بگویم که همه اینها بخش با همکاری حکومت ایالات متحده امریکا ممکن شده است. حکومت ایالات متحده امریکا با وجود هشدارهای زنان و دیگر جریانهای دموکراتیک افغانستان مبنی بر تروریستی بودن و عدم تغییر پذیری طالبان با این گروه تروریستی وارد گفتگو شد و به آنان پیمان صلح با ضمیمه‌های سری امضا کرد. در 3 سال گذشته هم حکومت ایالات متحده امریکا میلیاردها دلار پول مالیه دهندگان امریکایی را تحت عنوان کمک‌های بشردوستانه در خدمت این گروه تروریستی قرار داده و از این طریق آنان را قادر ساخته تا به قدرت بیشتر به تحکیم دیکتاتوری و رژیم آپارتاید جنسیتی خود بپردازند.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I have shared, my struggle here is fueled by the pursuit of a cherished personal dream to create and tend to a library of my own. Another and more significant part of this struggle is for the people who have been deprived of all their human rights by the Taliban. It is for the millions of girls who are prevented from going to school and university, for the hundreds and thousands of women who are forcibly unemployed and imprisoned within their houses. Yes, the biggest part of this fight is for the people who have been dehumanized in every sense and left alone for themselves under the rule of a terrorist group armed to the teeth. The struggle is for women who have been living under the rule of a gender apartheid regime for 3 years and who have been deprived of all their rights and are faced with exclusion, segregation and isolation, harassment, and oppression in all spheres of life. I am disappointed to say that all of this was partially possible with the cooperation of United States government. Despite the warnings of Afghan women and other democratic movements that the Taliban are terrorists and unchangeable, the United States government entered negotiations with a terrorist group and signed a peace treaty in Doha with secret annexes. Furthermore, in the past 3 years, the United States government has provided billions of dollars of American taxpayers' money in the name of humanitarian aid to this terrorist group. All the money spent and sent to Afghanistan enabled the Taliban to consolidate their power, dictatorship, and gender apartheid regime.
خانم‌ها و آقایان، این خلاف تمام موازین بین المللی، ارزش‌های حقوق بشری و آرمان‌های انسانی مردم امریکا و افغانستان است. من از اعضای محترم کمیسیون حقوق بشر کنگره ایالات متحده امریکا می‌خواهم بر مبنای کرامت انسانی و حقوق بشر، تکرار میکنم، بر مبنای کرامت انسانی و حقوق بشر، کنوانسیون‌ها و اسناد بین المللی حقوق بشر و در روشنایی دستورهای الزام آور مائده روم در اقدامات زیر در حمایت از زنان و مردم افغانستان را در دست گیرند. بر مبنای ماده 7 و 8 مائده روم، جنایت‌های گروه تروریستی طالبان علیه مردم افغانستان را و به ویژه زنان افغانستان به عنوان جنایت علیه بشریت به رسمیت بشناسید. از شما می‌خواهم آپارتاید جنسیتی حاکم در افغانستان را به عنوان جنایت علیه بشریت به رسمیت بشناسید. حاکمان طالبان را به عنوان یک نظام آپارتاید جنسیتی به رسمیت بشناسید. طالبان را به رسمیت نشناسید. این صدای مردم افغانستان، زنان افغانستان، مردهای افغانستان، کودکان افغانستان هست. طالبان را به رسمیت نشناسید و اجازه ندهید که پول مالیه دهندگان امریکایی در خدمت اهداف یک گروه تروریستی قرار گیرد. رفتار گروه طالبان در برابر گروه‌های قومی، زبانی، جنسیتی، فکری و فرهنگی در افغانستان خلاف تمام ارزش‌های انسانی و دموکراتیک است. این گروه در پی حذف پاکسازی تک تک افراد و گروه‌های غیر خودی است. از شما می‌خواهم با محکومیت طالبان و تغییر سیاست خارجی آمریکا در قبال این گروه مظهر دموکراتیک اراده مردم امریکا باشید. ممنون.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is against all international standards, human rights values, and human ideals of the people of the United States, as well as the people of Afghanistan. I ask the respected members of the Human Rights Commission and the United States Congress to take the following steps in support of women and people of Afghanistan based on human dignity and human rights. International human rights conventions and documents in the light of the binding orders of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. First, based on the Article 7 of the Rome Statute, the crime of the Taliban terrorist group against the people of Afghanistan, especially the women of Afghanistan, should be recognized as crimes against humanity. Second, I ask you to recognize the current gender apartheid regime in Afghanistan as a crime against humanity, and the rule of the Taliban as a gender apartheid system. Third, do not recognize the Taliban. This is the request of all men, women, and children back in Afghanistan. Do not recognize the Taliban as a state and do not allow American taxpayers' money to serve a terrorist group. Fourth, the treatment of ethnic, linguistic, gender, intellectual, and cultural groups by the Taliban in Afghanistan is against all humane and democratic values. This group seeks to eradicate, remove, and purify all individuals and groups that differ from themselves. I want you to be a true and democratic manifestation of the will of the American people by condemning the Taliban and changing the current foreign policy of the United States towards this group. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Mayron?
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
I think you're on. I think you just have to be closer to the mic. Yeah.
Okay,
There you go.
perfect. Today, I am speaking on behalf of Amnesty International USA and our more than 10 million members, activists, and supporters around the world. I'm humbled to be present here today. My statement is also supported by my personal capacity as a woman from Afghanistan currently in exile. On August 15, 2021, on what seemed like a normal day, I went as usual to the office at a US government-funded Girls Scholarship Project. As the papers of the 250 girls our project supported were burning, I left the office, heading towards fear and loss. Until I finally left, my life was confined to fearful glimpses from behind curtains, watching the world from a distance. This is the harrowing reality for every woman in Afghanistan now, subjugated and dehumanized to second-class citizens by oppressive laws, trapped inside their homes, living in what an Afghan woman journalist described to Amnesty as death in slow motion. Since their takeover of Afghanistan in August 2021, the Taliban has established systematic and institutionalized gender-based discrimination where women and girls are stripped of every human right. The Taliban issued decrees limit or prohibit the rights to education, employment, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, access to health services, to protest, and the practice of cultural activities such as participation in sports. Even activities like going to a park or a beauty salon are prohibited. Female humanitarian workers are restricted. Meanwhile, donors seeking to urgently address the humanitarian and economic crisis unfolding in Afghanistan haven't put in place appropriate safeguards to ensure the needs of women and girls. The Taliban has even closed shelters where women were seeking protection from domestic violence and relocated some of them to prisons and systematically dismantled all existing laws, policies, and institutions designed to eliminate violence and harassment against women. The Taliban replaced the Minister of Women's Affairs with the Minister of Vice and Virtue. In the highest judicial office of the previous government, the Attorney General's office with the General Directorate for Monitoring and Follow-up of Decrees and Directives. This restructuring has played a significant role in curtailing the rights of women. Women in Afghanistan are left without any means of access to justice. The restrictions and rules continue to become more brutal and draconian. Violating these decrees can lead to violence, imprisonment, torture, or even death by the Minister of Vice and Virtue. Amnesty has documented that since the Taliban returned to power in August 2021, women protesting Taliban's draconian policies have been forcibly disappeared, arbitrarily arrested, and detained and subjected to torture and other ill treatment, as Wahida explained. Based on my experience, not only they oppress them violently, but any space for them is also systematically shrunk. For instance, women I know, including Wahida, are forced to give video confessions, which are then published publicly. Some have been forced to name me specifically as having told them to protest in those forced confession videos. People of Afghanistan accused of moral crimes by the Taliban, including women and girls, are often subjected to extrajudicial executions, torture, and ill treatment, including public flogging and stoning. The Taliban have also engaged in a wider pattern of unlawful targeted killings of people whom the Taliban perceives as adversaries. It is also important to note that the Taliban's exclusion and targeted attacks impact Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks, and ex-military personnel, with women disproportionately experiencing the severest consequences. The intersectionality of gender with other forms of discrimination has added multiple layers of brutality to the oppression women face under the Taliban. Amnesty International urges you to leverage the United States government power to dismantle the Taliban system of gender persecution by continuously and meaningfully consulting women of Afghanistan and incorporate their perspective into policies and decisions concerning Afghanistan. Encourage the administration to build on the recent interactive dialogue at the Human Rights Council on the report of the Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan by supporting concrete actions to address the underlying deficit in accountability and creation of a UN-mandated accountability mechanism to document and preserve evidence. Appropriate funds for civil society strengthening and human rights defenders at risk both inside Afghanistan and in exile. Specifically, continued funding and support for women-led organizations inside the country, which play a vital role in keeping the hope and resilience of women and girls alive in the country. Appropriate funding to efforts and resources to improve domestic capabilities for documentation of human rights and support preservation of evidence of violations against women and girls in Afghanistan, with a view to support future accountability efforts, including prosecution and fair trials. This includes providing any relevant evidence within the custody of the United States government. Support diplomatic partners with domestic laws providing universal jurisdiction for the prosecution of crimes against humanity to exercise universal jurisdiction or other unlawful means to bring them to justice, especially Taliban members suspected of responsibility for crimes under international law. Continue to impose additional targeted sanctions on Taliban leaders and ensure the implementation and extension of travel ban. Take all reasonable steps to ensure the meaningful engagement of Afghan women and representatives of civil society in the UN Envoy meeting for Afghanistan and support the appointment of UN Special Envoy in the next months before the election. Finally, I ask the United States government formally recognize gender apartheid as an international crime under the draft UN Crimes Against Humanity Treaty under discussion in the UN General Assembly's 6th Committee. Gender apartheid must be recognized as a crime under international law in order to strengthen efforts to combat institutionalized regimes of systematic oppression and domination imposed on the grounds of gender. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Barr?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome, thanks. Good afternoon, and thank you, Representative McGovern, for holding this hearing on such an important and increasingly despairing topic. And thank you, Representative Crow, for making the time to be here as well. I joined Human Rights Watch in 2011 as the Afghanistan researcher and now work for the organization's Women's Rights Division. I lived in Afghanistan from 2007 to 2013, working first for the United Nations and then Human Rights Watch. I've continued to follow the women's rights situation very closely and have visited the country regularly in the past decade, although it has not been possible for security reasons for us to visit the country since the Taliban takeover in 2021. August 15th will mark 3 years since the Taliban took control of Afghanistan. During these years, they have systematically stripped women and girls of their rights and have created the world's most serious women's rights crisis, as Wahida and Mitra have powerfully described. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Afghanistan has called the situation gender apartheid. And Afghan women's rights defenders have rallied around an effort to have gender apartheid recognized as a crime under international law. The international response to this crisis has been, let me not mince words here, shockingly bad. We've seen a lack of coordinated action from governments and little action beyond statements of concern. Diplomats from numerous countries promise that they consistently raise women's rights issues in their meetings with Taliban officials. But we can all see now, 3 years later, that private interventions and public statements, unsupported by action, have had no meaningful impact in pressing the Taliban to curtail, let alone end, these abuses. We were especially dismayed by the decision of the United Nations to convene the third meeting of the Doha process, a high-level meeting of representatives and special envoys on Afghanistan from 25 countries with the Taliban in June 2024 that excluded Afghan women from the meeting and did not include women's rights on the agenda. This decision handed the Taliban an enormous victory at great cost to women that will endure long past the meeting. As an organization that works on women's rights around the world, Human Rights Watch believes that the woefully ineffectual international response to Afghanistan also has major harmful implications for women's rights globally. Bad actors abroad who share the Taliban's worldview will be emboldened because of the inadequate international response to this grave women's rights crisis. The United States government is a major actor in this situation and can do much more than it has. We're very aware of how politicized this situation has become, both on an international level in spaces like the UN Security Council and the Human Rights Council, and at the US domestic level. We understand that competing foreign policy interests and national concerns, such as security, American hostages, and counter-narcotics, affect US engagement on Afghanistan. But in fact, it is because the US has multiple interests in Afghanistan and with the Taliban that the US has the leverage and the opportunity to positively affect and even reverse the devastating conditions over half of Afghanistan's population is facing. The Taliban urgently need to be held accountable for their abuses and for their crimes. The US should take the 10 following important steps. Number 1, adopt legislation so that the US Office of the Special Envoy for Afghan Women, Girls, and Human Rights, who you've just heard from, Ms. Rina Amiri, is a permanent, fully funded office. Number 2, call on the United Nations and all other stakeholders to comply with UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security to ensure that Afghan women are full participants in all discussions about the future of their country. Number 3, call for the Doha 4 meeting, should it take place, to have a strong human rights focus on the agenda and include Afghan women as full participants. Number 4, authorize robust support for Afghan human rights defenders inside and outside the country, and for women and girls, virtual education programs, external continuous learning opportunities, and other programs that can invest in women and girls' development and future in innovative, safe, and secure ways. Work with other donors to scale up current successful programs to reach the over 1 million girls blocked from secondary education. Number 5, help restore public services, including healthcare, water management, and agriculture, in areas where women and girls are disproportionately affected. Number 6, the detailed P2 visa category for Afghans persecuted because of their US affiliation was appropriate for the first several years after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. But after 3 years of Taliban rule, the P2 category should be expanded to include women-headed households, including women survivors of domestic violence, defenders of women's civil and human rights, female police officers, and women or girls who qualify for education or need medical care but have been denied it because of their gender. Number 7, express support for the International Criminal Court's investigation in Afghanistan. Number 8, endorse and support calls for the creation of a new UN investigative mechanism with a mandate to collect and preserve evidence of and advance accountability for past and ongoing crimes in Afghanistan, including at the UN Human Rights Council's 57th session in September and October. Number 9, urge other states that have ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women to bring a case at the International Court of Justice regarding Taliban violation of the convention. And last but not least, number 10, publicly support the recommendations of the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Afghanistan, including by considering codifying gender apartheid as a crime against humanity. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Generini.
Chairman McGovern and honorable members, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. CFAM commends the co-chairman of the Tom Lantos Commission and their staff for bringing our attention to the shocking and systematic violations of the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan. We join our colleagues in calling on the U.S. government to make use of all available tools to hold those responsible to account and to bring victims the relief they need. My testimony will address the concept of gender in the context of discussions of a new international treaty on crimes against humanity currently being discussed in the General Assembly's 6th Committee, which is being promoted as a response to the outrageous abuses committed by the Taliban. Because of the seriousness of the topic and the gravity of labeling anyone hostis humani generis, enemy of the human race, I want to urge a strong note of caution against importing the notion of gender as a social construct, sometimes referred to as gender ideology, into the crimes against humanity framework. This pertains to both the established category of crimes against humanity known as gender-based persecution, already enshrined in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in 1998, and the newly proposed category of gender apartheid. When the Nuremberg trials were convened, the concept of crimes against humanity, which was then considered novel and controversial, became essential to bring justice to the victims of the Nazi regime and to hold perpetrators accountable. The basic tenet of the crimes against humanity framework is that there are certain crimes that are so egregious and inhumane as to be always and self-evidently criminal, so that anyone committing such crimes is deserving of punishment, even when the perpetrators act with the backing of the law or under military orders. While the gross violations of human rights perpetrated against women and girls in Afghanistan can indeed rise to the level of a crime against humanity, adopting the concept of gender as a social construct in the context of crimes against humanity presents serious legal challenges that remain unanswered. The concept of gender opens crimes against humanity to novel and dangerous interpretations, including the weaponization of international criminal law against opponents of gender ideology. As a result, anyone who believes that there are real differences between men and women based in biology could be labeled an enemy of humanity and an international criminal. Those calling for a broad definition of the crime of gender apartheid are transparent about their intent to bring about a broader vision of gender justice that goes beyond internationally recognized human rights through an open definition of gender. The Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has already adopted a definition of gender as a social construct that varies within societies and from society to society and can change over time. In a policy paper for the purpose of investigating and prosecuting precisely the crime of gender persecution. Under that policy, officials, politicians, religious leaders, and other public figures who do not agree with policies based on gender ideology could be accused of gender persecution. In a similar way, they could be accused of gender apartheid for their contribution to legal regimes that are deemed to institutionalize domination by one gender group over another. This puts a target on religious people around the world who believe in the complementarity of the sexes, including Catholics, Christians of all stripes, Muslims, and Hindus. Indeed, the charge of gender apartheid has been hurled against the Catholic Church because it only allows men to be ordained. Any legal measures that deny or limit the realization of gender ideology in schools, family law, religious spaces, and society more broadly could rise to the level of a crime against humanity, including restrictions on transgender identity change and sports policies, women's-only spaces, protections for parental rights and the conscience of health workers, and even restrictions on access to transgender hormone therapy and surgeries for minors. Using international criminal law to crack down on critics of gender ideology is not as far-fetched as it may seem. It is fully in line with the ongoing campaign by Western countries, and I am sad to report also the U.S. State Department, to silence what they call anti-rights groups. This Orwellian label has been applied to my organization, CFAM, as well as other U.S.-based organizations by UN mandates and organizations funded by the European Union and powerful foundations to silence and isolate views they don't agree with. Adopting gender ideology in the Crimes Against Humanity framework would undermine the goal of prosecuting the most heinous crimes and divert energy and resources to social engineering and even the totalitarian imposition of gender ideology. Gender ideology is first and foremost a theoretical and an analytical construct. It is designed for social studies and social engineering. The inevitable effect of introducing gender ideology in the Crimes Against Humanity framework is to call into question every aspect of social, political, and economic life as a potential crime against humanity. This is far from the original motivation for establishing a framework to prosecute crimes against humanity in the first place. It is fundamentally at odds with the principle that crimes against humanity must be self-evident and egregious. It is understandable that well-intentioned individuals and organizations would want to enhance protections for women and girls through the concept of gender apartheid. After all, it seems a powerful rhetorical tool. However, the confusion and indeterminacy that would result in international criminal law from such a doctrine makes it necessary to carefully review such proposals before Congress can lend them support. Our government, our international partners need to work on protecting the rights of women and girls. They must not use the Crimes Against Humanity framework to impose extreme and fringe views about gender and society that have nothing to do with protecting women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Adolph. See you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman McGovern, and I'm sorry that Chairman Smith could not be here, but I'm very grateful for this hearing and for the members of Congress that are here. I wish to really thank everyone for the opportunity to testify before the Thomas Lantos Human Rights Commission on women and girls in Afghanistan. So this comes at a time when states should be unified in their fight against the commission of all crimes against humanity. And we know that they're happening in many countries, but especially those committed against women and girls in Afghanistan, which are taking place now in a widespread and systematic manner by the Taliban. Efforts should be used to encourage states to employ all available means within the international community to bring these atrocities to an end. And in this, we've heard in particular the activities of the US government with respect to diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, international, and we should be also pursuing understandings and education of humanitarian law, international criminal law, and so forth. The International Criminal Court has jurisdiction, as we know, with Afghanistan in terms of the past investigations and current investigations that are going on. And depending upon the circumstances, we know that other tribunals could be eventually established. Consider, for example, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and the Residual Special Court for Sierra Leone. So there is law, criminal law, and criminal procedures are available, although they take time. The problem has to do with the nature of how enforcement operates within the international system per se. Having a crime of gender apartheid doesn't alleviate or avoid these issues. In such circumstances, in order to stop the commission of crimes against humanity, there needs to be political will, a unified approach from the international community, taking into consideration the responsibility to protect. When a state is unable or unwilling to protect its people, the international community must act together, pull together, and use diplomatic, humanitarian, and other peaceful measures. Obviously, last resort measures referring to military force lies within the Security Council. Yet, as if the existing tools are not enough, a proposal has been made to amend the draft Crimes Against Humanity Convention, in particular Article 2(2)H, the crime of apartheid, to encompass gender apartheid. My testimony focuses on this. Gender apartheid would be defined as, quote, inhuman acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one gender group over another gender group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime, end quote. The term is being promoted largely by the witnesses that we've seen and heard today, and also by UN entities and other non-governmental organizations and some states. It's worth noting that the crime of apartheid did not cause the dismantling of the apartheid regime in South Africa, but was created after the fact, after many efforts both inside and outside the country over a prolonged period of time. This is the nature of the beast, unfortunately, in international law. The purpose of my testimony and what I have written is really to caution against creating a new crime that would polarize the international community and distract states from working together to produce a unified response to assist the women and girls of Afghanistan. The reasons are due to the ambiguity of the term gender, the controversies historically surrounding the term, and the concerns regarding how a radicalized version of the expression gender apartheid might be used as a Trojan horse to eventually force certain states to adopt radical understandings of gender. Concerns would likely be voiced by Islamic states, conservative-led states with Christian populations, and the Holy See, which has diplomatic status. Pope Francis has been very adamant about his opposition to gender ideology and gender colonization. Unsurprisingly, tensions exist among the participants within the United Nations system, namely states, UN entities, non-governmental organizations, and others. Ambiguous language over the years has been introduced by like-minded states working with NGOs and UN organs to advance certain ideologies that are not agreed to by other states in binding international law. The debates over the term gender is just one example. It has been so serious that my research has discussed these disputes under the umbrella term gender wars. In 1995, the matter came to a head during negotiations for the Beijing World Conference on Women. One group of states promoted the idea of a universal human nature and related notions, for example, male-female, manhood, womanhood, motherhood, fatherhood, thereby rejecting the idea of a gender as a construct or social construct, while opposing states promoted gender as a social construct based on the premise that human nature and roles continually change and evolve over time. Given your group, which group you were a part of, you would be asking for the inclusion or exclusion of gender. Needless to say, reservation about one's sex and sexual relations are capacious ambiguities that mushroom into doubts about a whole range of issues that question the very foundation of human rights. This foundation, namely the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, recognized as it is certain premises based on a common understanding of a universal human nature, the human person, male and female, inherent human dignity, and the rights that flow therefrom. And that's a phrase from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, talking about how rights flow from inherent human dignity. In the absence of any consensus or agreed upon definition that binds states, the current effort to promote the new crime of gender apartheid is liable to backfire and drive states away from helping women and girls in Afghanistan. Consider, for example, the various definitions of gender that exist. Gender is a synonym for women and sex or women and children and sex. This was the common usage and continues to be the common usage within the United Nations system. Gender is a social construct distinct from biological sex. this has been and continues to be promoted largely by UN bureaucracy and some states. Gender is distinct from, but dependent upon biological sex. This was promoted by the Holy See and continues to be, and it was a statement made by the Holy See at the 1995 Beijing Conference on Women. Gender is the two sexes, male and female, in the context of society. This is the Rome Statute, a definition that has already been discussed. The dissatisfaction for gender feminists regarding the common usage of gender and the definition of the Rome Statute was perhaps best stated by Hilary Charlesworth, currently a judge of the International Court of Justice. And we do have a recommendation that we file a case there, which is not surprising because Judge Charlesworth would probably be more than willing to interpret or adopt in her reasoning this type of social construct gender ideology, or even the gender apartheid. As a scholar, why do I say that? Is because as a scholar, she lamented that gender had been defanged. That's her term. And it is, she described it as, quote, an insipid and bland concept, end quote, with little cutting edge. And she was referring to the common usage definition and the Rome Statute definition. And why was that? Because it was linked with biology. And it is at its narrowest in her terms, or worst, when it means women, children, or mothers. Scholars like Valerie Oosterveld have been strategizing with others to change the definition of gender in the Rome Statute through an interpretation that would conform the definition to the social construct theory. And we have just seen how the prosecutor's office of the ICC has gone in this direction. She urges those states, quote, supportive of a sensitive and forward-looking use of the term gender to plan ahead, work together during negotiations, and act as a cohesive bloc, end quote. Current discussions taking place within the United Nations system among its own participants involve allegations that those who do not agree with the social construct theory of gender are promoting anti-rights ideology, while some on the opposing side argue that the social construct theorists of gender are promoting, I would argue, an anti-natural rights theory. Again, the discussions are polarizing. Where is the effort to unify? Given the continued efforts, one should expect the new crime of gender apartheid to be interpreted by many states as a masked strategy to advance a polarizing agenda. This will not have a unifying effect on the international community, something needed to assist women and girls in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To those who are online, if you want to respond to any of the questions I asked, just put up your hand, and I could recognize you. And to those who are here, I can see you. But before I get into questions, Wahida, I would just like to, just for the record, ask you, what kind of library did you have? What kind of books? Who came? How long did you have it before the Taliban closed it?
شما پرسان میکنه که چی نوع کتابخانه داشتین، چی نوع کتابات او بود و چند مدت مصروف فعالیت های کتابخانه بودین تا ای که طالبان آن را بسته کرد.
تشکر میکنم از سوالتان. ما 1.5 سال کتابدار بودم و در کتابخانه ما 5000 کتاب بود، از کتاب‌های رمان، ادبیات، سیاست و یک گروه کتابخوانی داشتیم از دخترها، زنان افغانستان که گرد هم می شدیم، کتاب می خواندیم و در مورد کتاب صحبت می کردیم.
I was active and my library was active for 1.5 years before the Taliban closed it. There was 5,000 books inside the library, which included novels, literature, and books on politics. We also had a book club that many young Afghan women and girls were part of it. We were reading books, and we were talking about them, and we were sharing our ideas.
Thank you. Mr. Generini and Ms. Sedov, I hadn't read your testimony before the hearing, but and I'm not. I don't think I agree with you. Just to be totally honest with you, but I mean, I'm looking up the word apartheid, and it refers to the implementation and maintenance of a system of legalized racial segregation in which one racial group is deprived of political and civil rights. It's a crime against humanity, and it's punishable under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. In the case of what's happening in Afghanistan, and I think our witnesses have been pretty clear, people are being targeted not so much for their race, but for their gender, for being women and girls. As I said in the beginning, I mean, in my opening statement, women and girls have been denied access to secondary school and university. They don't have the right to attend. They're banned from working for national and international NGOs or UN agencies. They can't visit parks or go to gyms. All beauty salons have been closed. Women cannot protest. They cannot obtain a driver's license. They cannot be seen in public after 7. They cannot laugh aloud in public, and they must be covered from head to toe, and that's just the beginning of the things that they can't do, all because they are women. That is why, that is the way this system is being used. So when we look at the case of what's happening in Afghanistan, to me, the word gender apartheid applies. And I guess I'd be curious to the witnesses who testified before you. I want to give them an opportunity to maybe say for the record why adopting the crime of gender apartheid, why that is an appropriate step to take in this case. So whoever, if you're online, raise your hand. If you're here, Ms. Mayron.
Thank you. So it's the second round of Taliban taking power in Afghanistan. This demand is coming from women inside Afghanistan, both in the first round of the Taliban and now they describe their experience as gender apartheid. And in Afghanistan is the only country that every single human rights we know of is banned or restricted by the Taliban's decrees, and they are violently enforced by their soldiers, mainly their Minister of Vice and Virtue. And it's not one isolated crime or one isolated incident being perpetrated by a single group or an individual that other existing crimes can address. It's a totalizing, systematic, and an institutionalized system of discrimination attacking women. So that's why we believe, and Women of Afghanistan believes, that apartheid as a crime is the only framework that can encompass the totalizing nature of the crime Taliban are perpetrating inside Afghanistan, because it can address that totalizing nature in the Taliban regime, not only Taliban leaders or one individual or a group of Taliban, but their system or their governing system. So that's very important to note. The second one is I want to bring back the discussion to Afghanistan and what's happening there and what Women of Afghanistan describe as their experience. The other legal definitions or anything that friends raised here, I think we better leave it to the international legal experts to discuss it when the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty goes for negotiation. But at this point, what we need is solidarity and support of different states and countries to make sure they support codification of gender apartheid in that, and then the Crime Against Humanity Treaty goes forward for negotiation. We all know that international processes and mechanisms take really long, and Women of Afghanistan doesn't have time for that. And Crimes Against Humanity Treaty is a very unique and good opportunity for us that can actually fasten this process for us. And then the third thing, I think they mentioned it in the definition too, is by one gender group to other gender group. So when we are discussing case of Afghanistan, women are a group in Afghanistan, and other LGBTQ community are being targeted specifically. We need to recognize that inside Afghanistan too. So I think it's important that we hear to women of Afghanistan what they're saying and focus our discussion there. And that's why I think if they describe their experience as such, if I am or Wahida is, respecting that is very, very important. And we need international solidarity and support to make that happen.
Thank you. Ms. Barr?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I have a couple of responses. First of all, I just want to say that in the draft treaty, the fact that the definition of gender has been removed actually provides more space for states to decide what definition is appropriate in their particular context. So rather than sort of forcing a definition, it actually does the opposite. The second thing I wanted to say is the bar for what's considered to be apartheid is extremely high, and it's very difficult for me to understand any argument that sees that term being applied to the types of issues that that Professor Adolph and Mr. Generini have discussed. My organization works on human rights in about 100 countries. Since racial apartheid ended in South Africa in 1994, I believe that we've applied the term apartheid to a total of 2 countries. So I just really can't understand this argument. And you know, Mr. Generini has talked about Catholics being accused of apartheid, but you know, I wonder if that was by someone on Twitter, perhaps, because that doesn't really seem like a serious legal argument to me. It may be a rhetorical one. And then, yeah, the other thing I wanted to say is that while Professor Adolph has said that apartheid wasn't codified until after many years of it existing in South Africa, I don't agree that the codification process didn't help to end apartheid in South Africa. I'm actually speaking to you from Cape Town. I live in South Africa, and I think that people who look closely at the process that eventually succeeded in ending racial apartheid in South Africa would say that that discussion around codification and the way that that helped to build consensus in the international community was actually an essential part of the momentum that finally ended this horrifying abuse here in South Africa. And then just to reiterate some of what Mitra has said, this is a demand of Afghan women. They have consistently said that this is the best description of what they're experiencing. The special rapporteur has agreed with them that this is the most appropriate term to use to describe the situation facing women and girls in Afghanistan. And just a couple other thoughts. One is that this is a long and slow process. You know, negotiating and adopting a new treaty takes a very long time, and then having it come into force and then implementing that treaty obviously is a long and slow process. But I think that one of the reasons that Afghan women's rights defenders feel so strongly in favor of this effort is that I think that they see how having a serious discussion about codifying gender apartheid in international law can change the dynamic that's happening right now around Afghanistan, where the Taliban's conduct is being normalized. And more countries are sort of normalizing their relationship with the Taliban. And it's feeling a lot to Afghan women like the world's kind of moving on and forgetting about them. And this discussion about gender apartheid, I think, feels to many people like an antidote to that. So thank you for letting me respond.
No, I appreciate that, and I also appreciate your reminding us that part of what forced an end to apartheid in South Africa was the discussion of what was really happening on the ground in South Africa. I see Professor Adolph, you had your hand up. Okay, you have to put your mic. You have to put your mic on or unmute yourself.
Got it.
There.
Thank you so much for those comments. So in terms of the first argument that this is actually needed because of how it defines it as an organization. My understanding of the crimes against humanity, one of the elements is that it has to be widespread and systematic. So widespread and systematic could include the organizational element, and that would include torture, murder, persecution. And in the Rome Statute, gender is one of those grounds of persecution. And of course, gender is defined according to the definition in the Rome Statute. So I don't see from an organizational point of view what more that it adds. I think that's one of the elements of widespread and systematic. In terms of this idea of not defining gender, I think we've tried that in the international community, and it's just it's resulted in a lot of ambiguity. And I'm not persuaded, and I don't think Holy See was persuaded by the non-definitional approach, and which is why it offered a definition. In terms of the South African situation, if I might just, I went to the United States website to see what it had to say about the apartheid situation. And it doesn't mention the crime of apartheid on the United States website. It talks about actually the motivating factor, the key factor was the end of the Cold War. So the United States kept on supporting South Africa because South Africa at that time was really opposing communism, and I believe in Angola. So when the Cold War ended, the United States government felt that it didn't need the help anymore of South Africa and then turned to support South Africa. So the United States' own webpage never even refers to the crime. Now, that's not to say that it didn't help for discussions, but it wasn't even a key factor on the United States website. So I guess I'm not persuaded still that the crime is needed. I think widespread and systematic is an important element of it. I think that this might be interpreted by other states that it's another promotion of gender ideology as a world and global ethic, and that will cause polarization. Thank you.
No, I think you also just pointed out something that is part of U.S. history, and that is the U.S. turned a blind eye to apartheid in South Africa for many, many years, much to our shame. We finally ended up moving in the right direction, but for years we were called out on our indifference toward the systemic discrimination and brutality against people because of the color of their skin, and many people in the United States joined in protest and demanded that our government change, which I think also led to changes. I will tell you that when I was younger, I was part of an effort to do that. We were arrested in front of the South African embassy protesting that horrific policy and the fact the U.S. was so slow. But that doesn't make me feel that we shouldn't elevate gender apartheid to a different level. Maybe it might force, countries that want to remain neutral, or think that it's against their economic interests or whatever. But in the case of Afghanistan, I mean, it just seems to be so obvious what needs to be done. Mr. Generini, and then did you want to, Ms. Miri, did you want to say something? So I'll go to Mr. Generini, Ms. Miri, and then Ms. Maron. Okay.
Thank you, and I'm very sorry if my testimony wasn't submitted previously. I hope it will be available on the website, including
everything you said and your testimony will all be part of the record. Everybody's will be part of the record.
Thank you. There's a lengthier version, including footnoted with the documents. And
it'll all be part of the record.
So, with regards to what I said about the way gender is already being interpreted in international criminal law, including by the ICC prosecutor, that's all available in the full testimony, including the guidance on gender persecution according to the current definition of gender persecution in the Rome Statute. And so I'm not addressing a fictional concern here about an open definition of gender and how it's being employed in international criminal law. I'm addressing how already the International Criminal Court's prosecutor is targeting social groups, religious groups, based on their beliefs on the complementarity of the sexes, or with regards to the actual definition of gender in the Treaty on Crimes Against Humanity, I have to disagree with my colleague from Human Rights Watch. I am a lawyer, and I deal mostly in international human rights law, and lately also in this negotiation on the Treaty on Crimes Against Humanity. And the fact that the Treaty on Crimes Against Humanity removes the definition of gender from the Rome Treaty doesn't just leave an open definition of gender, because the reason the International Law Commission gave for removing the definition of gender was quite elaborate in endorsing an open definition of gender. So the effect of removing the definition of gender from the new Treaty on Crimes Against Humanity would effectively ratify what the ICC prosecutor is doing and applying an open definition of gender as socially constructed in international criminal law. So I think there is a clear danger there about indeterminacy and confusion that undermines the principle of legality. Thank you.
Ms. Amiri.
سی پیام از خانم‌های معترضه که با تعداد خیلیشان من صحبت کردم که من اینجا میرم سخنرانی دارم. پیامتان به این کمیته چی هست؟ سی خانم که شیبا رؤوفی پیام اصلیش بود که چی زمان رژیم تروریستی و پرورش تروریست پایان میدهید؟ پیام دریا نشأت: آیا وجدانهای جهان زنده است که امروز زنان در خیابانها، در صحراها محکمه صحرایی می شوند؟ و پیام از گروه آزادیخواه افغانستان، گروهی که توسط تفنگ به کوههای هندوکش به خاطر آزادی، به خاطر عدالت به مردم افغانستان می جنگن و خون میدن. پیام آنها این است که ما نظامی بودیم که به دولت کار کردیم، اما امروز ما به قتل می رسیم. جرم ما چی هست؟
I came here with 3 messages from 3 women protesters to talk about it. The first message is from Shiba Raufi. She asks, when are you going to stop this terrorist group? When are you stop funding this terrorist group? And when will be this regime over? The another message is from Darya Nashad. They're saying, word is turned a blind eye towards us. When they will address our problem? When this suffering and whole problem of Afghan women will go away? The another message is from the freedom fighters of Afghanistan. They are in Hindu Kush mountains, they are fighting, and they are saying, we were part of Afghan military, we served the government, and now we are fighting against the Taliban. What was our fault to become like this, distracted on the mountains and fighting these terrorist groups?
جمع خانم‌های معترض حرکت خودجوش زنان مبارز افغانستان، همه‌شان پیام اصلیشان ای بود که آپارتاید جنسیتی که امروز بالای زنان افغانستان جاری است به رسمیت بشناسید. توسط از این ما میتونیم که گروه تروریستی طالبان را به محکمه بکشانیم و پاسخگو قرار بدیم.
Group of women protesters are telling you, please recognize gender apartheid. So by this, we can address the problem of this terrorist group, the Taliban, and through that, we can fight them. Thank you.
Ren, you had a comment?
Yes. Shortly, I wanted to, on the elements of the crime of apartheid, one distinguished element that we need to, that is very important, that only apartheid framework can cover it, and we should speak about it in addressing what Professor's comment is the intention they seek by implementing the apartheid regime in Afghanistan, Taliban, and that is the sustainability of the regime, because it is existential for them. What's happening is they have changed the curriculum for the schools, so they brainwash and produce a group of young men who Taliban can control, who that can cultivate a space that a Taliban regime can breathe and sustain. And then by that, I think so it's both pragmatically and ideologically how they define their movement or how they interpret religion, that I am a Muslim and I don't interpret it that way, that serves their regime for their and its sustainability. So it is important to see what intention the Taliban are aiming for or going after by perpetrating the crimes of apartheid against women inside Afghanistan. So that's the intention that there is important, that they are maintaining dominance of state and men over women to make sure that their regime can sustain in Afghanistan. So I think that distinguishing element is very important to remember when we are discussing it in context of Afghanistan. One thing, and the second thing is, on base of for race, we have gender persecution. Yes, why we do not have gender apartheid? There is on base of race, there is persecution, and there is apartheid. Right. So and for many other crimes, we have genocide, and then we have Holocaust. So why we cannot have it for gender in women? That I think it shouldn't be a question. Thank you.
No, I appreciate everybody's comments, but. I should say for the record that the Taliban has condemned this hearing, and so they know we're talking about their horrific crimes against women and girls. But as people were talking, I Googled the definition of persecution by the ICC's definition of persecution, and it's defined as the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights contrary to international law by reason of the identity of the group or collectivity. And surely we all can agree that no group or collectivity should be subject to this, however the group is defined. Let me ask, Afghanistan has ratified a number of international human rights treaties, including those on civil and political rights, the rights of the child, the prohibition on torture, and the prohibition on discrimination against women. The International Criminal Court could exercise its jurisdiction over the crimes listed in the Rome Statute committed on the territory of Afghanistan or by its nationals from May 1, 2003 onwards. And the ICC has an investigation underway that predates the return of the Taliban. Yet several of you have mentioned the concept of gender apartheid and argue for its adoption in international law in response to the gender persecution in Afghanistan. What international legal avenues to pursue accountability for gender persecution in Afghanistan already exist, and are they being used to the fullest? What are the prospects for an ICJ case? And I think you've all gave your opinion on, the why or why not gender apartheid would add to moving us forward. But I'm trying to understand within the existing framework, what can be done, what should be happening, where should our pressure be? And I open that up to whoever. I'll go Mr. Giannarini, Ms. Mayron, and
Certainly. So there are several human rights mechanisms that can be used, and I think my understanding is they are already being used to several extents to bring to bear, including the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which also the United States has ratified, and so it's a treaty that we care deeply about. I do want to just clarify that the issue here is not the concern is not so much with the concept of apartheid, but it's the concept with a social construction of gender, sort of an open definition of gender, in a sense that this is a very overbroad category, and the interpretation of persecution and likely apartheid that we are going to see from international tribunals and committees is going to be one of a socially constructed definition of gender, which is something that is still controversial even here in the United States.
It should be, but no matter how you define it, surely nobody, I hope nobody here is advocating that any group should be persecuted.
Of course not.
Right, so, yeah, I mean, so
But yes, of course not, and no group should be persecuted, and that's why there is the crime of gender persecution, race persecution, persecution against any individual group. But of course, the way the term gender is being applied by the ICC prosecutor goes beyond the mere crime of persecution. It goes also towards, and it defines it very broadly as any deprivation of fundamental rights, including with regards to reproductive options, including, so for example, denial of abortion is being treated as a form of gender-based violence by several human rights experts, and denial of abortion would be considered an element of the crime of gender apartheid also. So the issue here is, how do we define gender? Are we going to use a very broad definition, or are we going to say it refers to men and women, a binary, as the international, the statute of the International Criminal Court did?
Ms. Mayron?
Thank you. So I want to emphasize that I personally, we do believe in that existing international mechanisms are complementary to each other, and all existing processes should be used because the crises in Afghanistan are really really bad and worse, and the trajectory it's set in the life of women and girls in Afghanistan won't be reversible for decades to come. So the first option is International Criminal Justice Court. Different human rights organizations and human rights defenders and women and men from Afghanistan are working with different countries to take using CEDAW to take the case of Afghanistan to ICJ, and I hope U.S. government use its influence to encourage some of the countries to engage in that process. And then the other option is using gender persecution that Amnesty International has a report on, and we emphasize on using that is a case of Afghanistan in ICC. For that purpose, again, U.S. government can help with funding and resources that they definitely need at this time. And the third option that exists that we are pushing for is codification of gender apartheid and the existing crimes against humanity treaty under consideration in the 6th Committee of UN General Assembly. They're going to have a meeting on October to decide if they want to take to the negotiation, the treaty to negotiation or not. Hopefully we have the endorsement and support of U.S. government there. And then the fourth thing is the UN mandated Doha process. We are, the initial understanding is there should be a special envoy, and then so they can negotiate and speak about the situation in Afghanistan. Both it's important for women, but also the inclusivity of the government or any political settlement that comes out of it. The important thing is support of U.S. government and Congress to make sure that the special envoy that's supposed to be introduced by the UN should be appointed as soon as possible so it can start work there. In that process, we need to make sure that women and people of Afghanistan are heard and the process is inclusive. And other existing procedures and mechanisms that can be utilized.
Thank you. Ms. Barr?
Yeah, thank you. So Mitra's already covered a lot of the ground that I was hoping to talk about, but I'll just add a little bit on what she said. Afghans have been waiting for a long time for the International Criminal Court to act, but we are hopeful that their investigation is going to lead to warrants in the near future, or in the reasonably near future. And then when it comes to the International Court of Justice, there are, I believe, 147 countries that have accepted the jurisdiction of the ICJ when they ratified CEDAW. And so that means that there's a really broad set of countries who individually or in a group of several states could bring this kind of a case. And I think we've seen a real development of jurisprudence within the International Court of Justice in the area of upholding human rights. And this would be a really obvious case for them to be asked to decide about. And I think that it would bring some meaningful relief. As Mitra says, we really see all of these different mechanisms as being complementary, and this crisis being so severe that it's important to pursue all of them at the same time. And then I'll just mention again the notion of a new UN mechanism to collect and preserve evidence of crimes committed in Afghanistan. This is something that we, along with many other groups and with many Afghan experts, have been asking for since even before the Taliban took power. We really, this effort, we were sort of pulled together by Shahrazad Akbar, who was the former head of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission before the Taliban dissolved that institution. And after a really horrific an attack on a girls' high school in Kabul in the spring of 2021, she brought together a group of organizations, including us, including Amnesty and others, to start this push for a new UN mechanism. I think what happened is that we instead got the special rapporteur, and he's been extremely important and has done very valuable work, but it's not the same as a mechanism to collect and preserve evidence. And we still need that. We need it desperately. And the best vehicle to do that would be through the Human Rights Council. And the next session is very important because at the next session, the High Commissioner for Human Rights will be presenting a report that he's been requested to do, outlining accountability options in Afghanistan. And I just want to really highlight that every day that this mechanism doesn't exist, there's evidence that's being lost of crimes that are being committed, such as the crimes that were committed against Wahida. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions, but does anyone, anybody want to, or did you want to say anything, Wahida, or should we go to the next question?
Can I say something?
Oh, yeah, I didn't say, okay, I'll go to you, Professor.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for those comments. I guess every venue that has been mentioned to promote gender apartheid that's going to involve resolutions or any other states, there's going to be a huge fight. And so this is what I wrote about. This is what I'm concerned about. This is my testimony that I gave. With respect to the ICJ, you have Judge Hillary Charlesworth, who promotes a very aggressive social construct, a definition of gender. And the proposals here today are to go before that court. And I think we all know why. So we've got some problems right now. I can see a lot of disagreements are going to take place in every single one of these venues. And my question is it worth it? Are we really helping the women and girls of Afghanistan? When you can charge concurrently different crimes that are widespread and systematic, that are organized, that you have the intent that could be persecution, torture, and all of the other long list of crimes that are being committed by the Taliban. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I just want to say one thing is that we were talking about the IGC. For example, I mean, we have existing international institutions that unfortunately the United States, when we have a disagreement, attack them and undermine their credibility, which is something that I find really objectionable. You know, so we could talk about these international institutions, but it's important that we respect them enough to not just simply, when our politics don't align, that we attack them. We can't pick and choose, where our outrage is. Before I go into the next one, do you have anything to say, Ms. Amiri? Okay.
یک چیزی را که میخواستم اینجا بگویم که ما زنان افغانستان دادخواهی را که برا انداختیم مسئله یا سیاست افغانستان امروزه تنها مسائل زنان افغانستان که ما از گروه تروریستی بخواهیم که دروازای مکاتب باز شود و دروازای کار باز شود بر روی زنان افغانستان و مسائل سیاسی افغانستان همین گپ است. میخوایم برش بپردازم که مسائل سیاسی افغانستان قدرت گرفتن از طالبا هست و واگذاری قدرت به دست مردم افغانستان. ما از گروه تروریستی نمیخواهیم که دروازای مکاتب باز شود، دروازای دانشگاه باز شود. واقعا ما پرسش داریم اگر دروازای مکاتب دانشگاه باز شود، نصاب تعلیمی آموزش پرورش ما چی هست؟ ما خواهان آموزش پرورش با معیارهای جهانی هستیم. یعنی ای که حالا ما بخوایم زنان افغانستان هم بکشانیم که تروریسم تربیت شود و مسائل افغانستان بسته شود. ما خواهان ای هستیم که گروه تروریستی طالب را قدرت از پیش طالب بگیریم و جنایتی را که امروز طالب سر مردم افغانستان انجام میده، از محکمه صحرایی گرفته، از تجاوزی که سر زنان افغانستان صورت میگیره و نظامیایی که به قتل میرسن، هر روز در زندانهای طالب شکنجه میشن به خاطر از اینکه در بخش نظامی کار میکردن، قدرت گرفته شود و طالب به محکمه بین المللی کشانده شود. این آرزوی تمام زنان معترضی بوده که به خیابان برآمدن و صدای عدالت بلند کردن. ممنون.
We Afghan women, we say that the issue of opening schools, having employment opportunities for women, these are not only the political issues that we are talking about. We Afghan people want to take the control of our own country. We don't want the power to be consolidated in hand of one group, a terrorist group, the Taliban. We don't want them to open the doors of schools, universities for our girls, unless we don't know that what is the curriculum that they are teaching in the schools. Are they training terrorist groups? Will they radicalize our children? We want to know that. Rather than we want a standard world-class education in our universities and in our schools, if that has to be opened. We want to take the power from the Taliban group. They are the ones who are killing, persecuting, kidnapping, and torturing not only Afghan women protesters, former military staff, forces, and all other advocates. We want the group to be eligible and also addressed for the crimes with the criminal court, with an international platform, and we want them to we want our country to be ours back again, and we rule them, not a terrorist group, the Taliban.
Thank you. And I have two questions. I'm going to ask them both at once. You people have been very patient. We've already been here for 2 hours, but I think these questions are nonetheless important to get your answers on the record. So let me ask them both, and then whoever wants to respond can respond. I have, as a matter of principle, I have long supported engagement with our adversaries rather than totally isolating them. Important to be able to have discussions and conversations. But I've heard in some of the testimony here that some are concerned about engaging the Taliban could help legitimize them in some sense. So my first question is, what principles should guide the United States and other governments in their engagement with the Taliban, number one? Two, can you identify any strategies that have been effective in pushing back on the Taliban's persecution of women. Are there any lessons to be learned from the last 3 years in this regard? And whoever wants to go,
Can you repeat the second question, please?
you want me to repeat the question?
The second question.
So the second question is, can you identify any strategies that have been effective in pushing back on the Taliban's persecution of women? Are there any lessons to be learned from the last 3 years in this regard? Has anything been effective? Has anything moved the needle? And Ms. Barr, I don't know whether your hand's up from the last question or it's still up. I don't know if you want to.
Sure, it was up from before, but
Okay,
maybe
I'm
I
sorry,
can
okay.
say a little bit about
right.
about your two questions as well, if that's all right.
Yeah, go ahead. We'll begin with you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to say first, though, just the reason I'd raised my hand before was I just wanted to say you have several Afghan women in front of you talking about their experiences and telling you about legal mechanisms that they want the United States government to use to try to uphold their rights. And so when another witness comes and says that these processes are complicated and is it really worth it and is it actually really going to help Afghan women, I think I just want to remind us all that the way to help Afghan women is to start by listening to them and having them tell us what they need and want. And I hope that that's an important guiding principle for U.S. policy. I think Rina Amiri has explained very clearly that from where she sits, it certainly is. To turn to your questions, Representative McGovern, so I think that in terms of principles for engaging with the Taliban, Afghan women's rights defenders have talked a lot about how I think most of them feel like they're not against all engagement. Some are, but many are not. They just feel that engagement has to be principled. And that can mean several different things. It can mean not normalizing the Taliban, not rolling out red carpets for them, sending private jets for them, not sending delegations of all men to meet with them, and not posing for smiley photographs. That might seem inconsequential, but it's not. And not making deals with them that enhance them and that normalize them. And so, when we talk about aid delivery, we want to talk about aid delivery that is delivered without passing aid through the Taliban, and that's directed specifically at supporting women-led organizations and so on. And then the last thing I'll just say is, in terms of lessons learned, unfortunately, I think the main lesson that we've learned is quite a grim one, which is that the Taliban haven't given an inch and the world has come to them instead. And so a lot of the kind of diplomatic strategies that I think people thought could convince the Taliban to bend have failed. And that's really why it's time for us to be thinking about new strategies. And that's why I think all three of us have focused so much on accountability mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Adolph, do you have your hand up? No? Okay. Anybody? Ms. Miri, Wahida?
ما سوالا را کم هم متوجه شدیم. خب برش میپردازم به چیزی که در این 3 سال خودم تجربه کردم. سوالی که شما میگین که ما طالبان را به رسمیت نمیشناسیم. خب افتوار امریکا پول برشان روان میکنه به عنوان از که ما کمک های بشردوستانه را انجام میدیم. آیا کدام کمیته وجود داره که شفافیت نشان بده که این پول به دسترس طالبان قرار نمیگیره و قدرت طالبان را زیادتر نمیکنه؟ من از خود این سوال یک بخش رسمیت دهی و جنایت ما تلاش که داریم که زیادتر میگیم طالبان را به رسمیت نشناسین، ای که بتانیم امروزه مردم افغانستان که در وحشت وجود داره این برمیخوره به ای که به رسمیت نشناسید، به این معنا که گروه تروریستی را تقویت نکنیم، ریشه های گروه تروریستی را ما از بین ببریم یا در کشور ما یا کشورهای منطقوی و جهان تقویتش کرده بریم. بعد مسئله دیگه کدام شما چیزی که ترجمان برای ما ترجمانی کرد که شما میگین که آیا کدام کمیته یا چی استراتژیکی را ما در پیش بگیریم که طالبان را قناعت بدیم. آیا ما به حیث یک کره زمین در اینجا به حیث انسان زندگی میکنیم یا نه؟ آیا ما فراموش میکنیم اعلامیه جهانی حقوق بشره؟ افغانستان عضویت جامعه جهانی و اعلامیه جهانی حقوق بشر داره. پس ما قانون میخواهیم، تطبیق قانون میخواهیم در کشور خود. چیزی که در اعلامیه جهانی حقوق بشر ذکر شده مطابق معیارهای بین المللی، مردم افغانستان، زنان افغانستان حق دارند که زندگی بکنند و این مکلفیت تمام جهان و جهانیان است. با سرنوشت مردم ما، با سرنوشت اطفال ما، با سرنوشت زنان افغانستان معامله صورت گرفته. طالبان را ما باید قناعت بدیم که مطابق قانون پیش برن. نه این که شما در کدام جهان امروز زندگی میکنید. طالب میگه فرهنگ ما است که دخترها مکتب نره. شما به موضوعات داخلی افغانستان اجازه ندارید که دخالت بکنین. بر کدام منطق ما میاییم می صحبت میکنیم؟ خب ما پس همین ما میخوایم، ما قانون میخوایم به مردم افغانستان، عدالت میخوایم به مردم افغانستان. مگر خود امریکا سران طالبان را گروه تروریستی معرفی نکرده بود؟ جایزه تعیین نکرده بود؟ امروزه چطور وجدان مردم قبول میکنه که اون گروه تروریستی سر میلیون ها مردم افغانستان حاکم شده؟ پس من این سوال شما برمیخوره بر خود شما، به جامعه روشنفکری، به جامعه که انسانها آزادانه میاین صحبت از آزادی بیان میکنن. شما دیدین که در مقابل صدای زنان افغانستان چگونه خفه شد؟ زن معترض افغانستان چگونه تجاوز سر صورت گرفت؟ تشکر.
To answer your questions, I would say that you support and send money biweekly as a humanitarian aid back to the Taliban. I would like to know, is there a transparency, accountability committee, or any mechanism that makes sure the Taliban is not using that aid and fund for their own strength, for their own way to become consolidating in the power? Is there anything? We want to say that when we say don't recognize the Taliban means don't strengthen them, even indirectly. Afghanistan is member of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights Commission, and what we want is enforcement of law. In that declaration, in all these sort of humanitarian laws, women has all rights to education, right to employment, right to freedom of speech, and everything. But there has been a deal with the destiny of all my Afghan fellow women. The deal to their destiny, the deal that they cannot have their freedoms. How you gonna answer this? Make sure the Taliban accept these rules and laws and regulations of internationally. We want justice. We want enforcement of law in Afghanistan. U.S. and the government of U.S. has bounty on their heads of leaders of the Taliban and Haqqani group, and they are in wanted list. How the world can accept to negotiate with them, sit at the same table and talk to them. What we want is that you stick to your promise and make sure to bring them to the justice and ask about everything that Afghan women and men suffered because of them and make them accountable for that.
Thank you so much for having us. I think one thing that we want is principled engagement and clarity and clearance on what that engagement means. People of Afghanistan have been kept in shadows, in dark, since the previous Doha processes started that lead to the engagement in signature of the agreement with the Taliban. So first thing and most important thing is how principled are these engagements and what those engagement means for the protection of rights of women in Afghanistan and inclusivity of other people living in Afghanistan in any of those processes. And are you clear enough about it? Is it communicated with the people? I think that is the most important thing, speaking of engagement. Speaking at a personal capacity, I think it has been very disappointing the past 3 years. There has been leverages, but it hasn't been used. International community, especially United States government, treatment of the Taliban has been very appeasing. Whatever they do, even the UN do it. And instead of going against those decrees, for example, ban on education, employment, and even ban on humanitarian aid workers, what's happening is they are trying to see how they can work around those decrees. And what are we measuring if that's emboldening or supporting Taliban, or is it weakening them? So I think recognizing political agency of women of Afghanistan, especially women who are protesting on the streets, are very important that they be recognized and be part of any decision-making processes. So I think for me, I want to conclude by saying it's important that we listen to the people of Afghanistan and also recognize the political agency of women in these processes and not see them as just victims, and be honest and open with the people in whatever we do about their future. Thank you.
Mr. Jerry, did you want to add anything? Or okay. Well, I appreciate everybody being on this panel. I think it is important to make clear that the whole world should be horrified by the way women and girls are being treated in Afghanistan. It cannot be accepted, and you're absolutely right. And I think we, as we talk about humanitarian aid, getting to people in need, we have to make sure that there's accountability, that there's transparency, and that the wrong people are not benefiting. And I agree with the statements that any kind of communication with the Taliban or any kind of engagement, it can't be on their terms. It has to be on the terms that are set by people who care about human rights. Human rights needs to be front and center. The issue confronting girls and women need to be front and center. I appreciate the conversation on gender apartheid. I will say to Mr. Giannarini and to Professor Adolf, I don't think I don't agree with you. I would, I think that, again, listening to the women of Afghanistan, I think this is important. I think my views are in that direction. I would also say I do think that that governments should not be allowed to control women's bodies either. And so I know some find that controversial, but I just think we have to understand that women shouldn't be controlled by any government, any place in the world. But this, I think, has been a very this hearing has been very enlightening, and and if nothing else, I wanted to be clear to the Taliban that this issue is not going away, and there is broad-based opinion that that what they're doing is criminal, and so this won't be the last hearing we do. And we will continue to work with all of you to figure out concrete steps that we might take in the future. So with that, I thank you, and this hearing is adjourned. I don't have a gavel, so it's my fist. That's it. Thank you.